My name is Genevieve Carter, 43, former Lieutenant Colonel of the U.S. Army. I survived war zones and carried secrets that cost souls. But nothing could have readied me for that courtroom. My own brother stood and yelled, "She's just a fake veteran." The words hit like sniper fire. In that suspended moment, I didn't flinch. I unzipped my briefcase, drew out a thin tan folder, and slid it across the judge's bench. He read, paused, then closed the doors. No one moves. Military police filled the courtroom. What was meant to strip my honor became the spark that ignited the truth. Before we go any further, I want to know, where in the world are you hearing this from? Share it in the comments, because even if our paths are different, pain and strength sound the same everywhere. But that wasn't the whole story. The air in the courtroom was thick with the sterile scent of old paper and nervous sweat. Every eye in the gallery was fixed on me, a sea of judgment under the cold, unforgiving light of the fluorescent panels overhead. It was a Monday in late November, the kind of gray day in Boston where the sky felt heavy enough to fall. Outside, the familiar city rhythm hummed, the distant wail of a siren, a bus groaning to a halt on Congress Street. But inside, it was a tomb. I sat still. The only movement was the trembling of the water glass on the table in front of me, a small, involuntary tremor I couldn't control. My brother, Douglas, all brutal charm and manufactured outrage, stood at the witness stand. He wasn't a witness to the truth, just a performer. He spoke with the rehearsed indignation of a man who believed his own lies. His voice carried a certain practiced sorrow as he laid out his case against me, piece by piece. His attorney, Eva, a woman with a chillingly rehearsed grace, guided him through his testimony, her every question a gentle push toward the next fabricated injustice. They had built this moment carefully, brick by brick, from a place I once called home. The hum was here, too, a different kind now. A low, constant buzzing in the speakers of the audio system, a flicker in the overhead lights. It was the sound of a system under stress, of a reality being distorted. I felt the familiar weight of my dress blues, folded neatly in my carry-on at my feet, a tangible contradiction to every word spoken in the room. They had built a narrative so convincing, so complete, that even the silence of my family, seated behind Douglas, felt like a judgment against me. My younger brother, Mason, was there, too, a warm steel in his gaze that I couldn't quite decipher. His presence was a small, confusing comfort in a room of strangers, even if he didn't speak. Douglas leaned into the microphone, his voice a theatrical whisper. She wasn't there, he said, his eyes scanning the room for effect. She wasn't on that deployment. She faked her entire career. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. That was the moment. The hum became a low, angry roar. It was the sound of a public lie gaining weight, of my reputation disintegrating in real time. My honor, my years of service, my very identity, they were all on the line. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply watched as the lie took shape. This was their truth. It wasn't mine. It was a lie they had told so many times that it had become their reality. They erased my name. They repurposed my silence. They misread my discipline. They didn't see the years of training that taught me to remain still under fire. They saw only a woman with no defense. My hand found the thin folder in my bag. The texture of the manila paper was familiar, grounding. The facts inside were simple, but they were the only weapons I needed. As Douglas finished his tirade, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't a soldier anymore, but the habits of my training remained. I was watching the field, assessing the threat. And in that moment, the only threat I saw was a man standing on a lie. The judge looked at me. He was waiting for a reaction. My silence was its own reply. It was a sniper shot, aimed and ready. The story didn't begin with a courtroom. It began with a house. A shingled, weathered house perched on the cliffs overlooking Monterey Bay. That was our family home, a place of crashing waves and salty air, where the sun dripped gold onto the water in the mornings. It was a place of legacy, or so my brothers were always told. I was the youngest, the only daughter. In our family, legacy was something boys inherited. It was something they were groomed for. Douglas, the eldest, was the heir apparent, all loud confidence and ambition. Mason, the middle brother, was the quiet one, the observer. I was something else. I was a flicker. A small light that wasn't quite seen. Our days were simple. Mornings started with the familiar scent of my father's coffee brewing and the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. My father, a stern but gentle man, would sit at the table, a map spread out before him. He'd talk to Douglas about business, about the future of the family's modest land trust, the legacy he was building. He'd look at Mason, and they would share a silent understanding. When he looked at me, he would smile a different kind of smile. It was warm, but a little sad. He'd say, "Evie, some things you protect no matter the cost." I never quite understood what he meant. The family's land trust, a patchwork of small vineyards and seaside property, was my father's life's work. The house was the heart of it all. He told the boys it would be theirs one day, their inheritance to protect and grow. He never told me anything. I was just the girl who loved to climb the cypress trees and watch the tide go out. I was a part of the landscape, but not the legacy. I joined the military at 18. It was less a choice and more an escape. A way to find purpose when I wasn't offered one at home. I didn't get a parade. There was no big celebration. Just a quiet car ride to the recruiting station in San Francisco and a handshake from my father. Douglas barely looked up from his phone. Mason just gave me a look that was hard to read, a flicker of something that I mistook for sadness. My path was a crack, a fissure in the seamless facade of my family. I was meant to stay, to be the dutiful daughter, but I couldn't. I had to go. The years bled into one another. Deployment after deployment. I was a ghost to them. My name was mentioned only in passing, if at all. I was the sister who left. The daughter who chose a life of dust and discipline over the comfortable, gilded cage of our home. I lived on a different continent, under a different sky, and the silence from my family was more constant than any radio hum. I was there, of course. For my mother's funeral. For my father's last Christmas. I'd fly into SFO, rent a car, and drive the familiar route down Highway 1. I'd walk into the house and the air would feel different, colder. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the same, but the life inside was gone. I was a guest in a home that was once mine. And on his deathbed, my father took my hand. His voice was a thin whisper, a ghost of the man who had taught me to protect things. He told me he'd made a final change to his will. He looked at Douglas, at Mason. Then he looked at me, and his eyes held the same sad smile as before. He said, "Evie, it's yours. Protect it." He was talking about the house, the core of the land trust, the heart of our legacy. He had left it all to me. Not to the sons who had been groomed for it, but to the daughter who had left. To the one who had learned to protect things, no matter the cost, in a way they would never understand. And in that moment, I knew I had a mission. Not just to inherit the house, but to defend my father's final wish. I just didn't know what I was defending it against. Until that night. The night the will was read, the air was heavy with unspoken words. It was a small gathering at my father's attorney's office in downtown San Francisco. A modern office building made of glass and steel, a stark contrast to the old, salty house on the cliffs. It was just the three of us and the attorney. I sat still, my hands clasped in my lap, trying to control the familiar tremor. The attorney cleared his throat. He spoke in a flat, monotone voice, a list of assets and directives. He got to the final section, the disposition of the main family trust. He read the language that gave the land and the house to me in trust. To me. Not to the brothers who had stayed, who had worked with my father, who had been told their whole lives it would be theirs. The silence that followed was a physical presence, a dense, suffocating thing. Douglas's face went white, then a violent red. His brittle charm cracked. He slammed his hand on the table. "This is a joke," he spat. "You can't be serious. What about the work we did? The hours, the plans?" He looked at me, his eyes full of a sudden, brutal hatred. "She did nothing. She abandoned us." The attorney, a man of quiet authority, just shook his head. "The will is clear. This is what your father wanted." That was the beginning. The first shot fired. The flicker was becoming a full-blown flame of conflict. They didn't contest the will immediately. They began a different campaign. It was a slow, deliberate drip of information to family friends, to the press, to the wider community. Rumors. First about me being an absent daughter. Then about me being a gold digger. Then about my service. The public event was a gala for a national veterans charity held in a massive, brightly lit ballroom in the heart of Washington, D.C. I was a featured speaker, set to receive an award for my work with a new nonprofit. The air hummed with the buzz of 1,000 conversations, the clinking of glasses, the loud, celebratory music. I was in my dress uniform. It felt both like a part of me and a foreign skin in this environment. I saw Douglas and Eva across the room. They weren't supposed to be there. Their presence was a surprise, a cold shock. Douglas, in a sleek tuxedo, was speaking to a prominent news anchor. I watched him, and my instincts screamed at me. I could see the rehearsed grace on Eva's face as she listened, a small, knowing smile on her lips. Then she saw me. Her smile didn't falter. It just grew wider. I was called to the stage. I walked to the podium, the spotlight hot on my face. As I began to speak, my words a familiar cadence of gratitude and reflection, I felt a vibration in my pocket. My phone. A text from an unknown number. A single, grainy image of a forged discharge paper with my name on it, marked as dishonorable. Another text with the words, "This is the truth. Tell them who you really are." The hum was a cacophony in my ears now, a high-pitched shriek. I felt a surge of nausea, a sudden wave of dizziness. My vision blurred for a split second, and I almost stumbled. My body was screaming, but my discipline held. I looked out into the crowd. Douglas was standing in the back, a triumphant smirk on his face. Eva was filming him with her phone, a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture. The news anchor was now looking at me, her eyes narrowed, her hand holding her phone. I knew what was happening. They were feeding the lie to the media, live, in a room full of people who were here to celebrate my service. I finished my speech, my voice steady, my hands a little shaky. I walked off the stage, the applause a distant sound. I wanted to scream, to shatter the glass walls of that room. But I didn't. I walked through the crowd, past the news anchor who was now on her phone, past Eva who just smiled, past Douglas who was just watching me. I walked out of that ballroom and into the cold DC night. The sodium lights of the street lamps cast a sickly yellow glow on the pavement. I leaned against a cold brick wall, my breath coming in short, gasping sobs. The cacophony of the room was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the city, the gentle thrum of cars passing by. It was the hum of a world that didn't care, of a city that was indifferent to my pain. I was out there alone, the city a cold, indifferent witness to my public execution. I drove all night, the car a small, metal bubble of silence in a world that felt like it was crumbling around me. I made it to New York City just as the sun was rising, a hazy orange smear against the pale Manhattan skyline. I parked my car in a small lot in Chelsea and just sat there, the air smelling of a cold, damp dawn. The world was still, but inside me, a silent detonation was happening. I pulled out my phone. The texts had stopped, but now there were emails. Dozens of them. From news outlets, from friends, from family. The same question over and over again, is this true? They attached a PDF of the forged document, a digital copy of my dishonorable discharge. I had never seen it before. The details were all wrong, the signatures were clumsy forgeries, but to an outsider, it looked real. I went to a small, quiet coffee shop on a side street. The air was thick with the scent of roasted beans and warm milk. I ordered a coffee, just to have something in my hands. I sat at a small table in the corner and opened my laptop. I started searching. I found the news stories, the social media posts, the video clips of Douglas talking to the news anchor, the one of me walking off the stage. The betrayal was public, a spectacle for the world to see. It was in that moment, in that quiet coffee shop, that I understood the full scope of what they had done. It wasn't just about the house. It was about my identity. They didn't just want to take my inheritance, they wanted to take away who I was. They wanted to erase my service, to brand me as a fraud, to make me a nobody. They had weaponized my story, turned it into a weapon to destroy me. The hum had become a sickening, low-pitched drone, the sound of my life being dismantled. I sat there for hours, not moving. The coffee got cold. The day went from hazy dawn to bright noon. My phone hummed with notifications, but I didn't look at it. I was in a place where silence was the only language I could speak. It was the silence of a house after the fire, a battlefield after the fighting. It was the silence of a collapsed trust. The loss wasn't just a house. It was a family. It was the hope of a reconciliation that was now impossible. It was the memory of a father's last wish, now a battlefield. Have you ever stood inside this kind of silence, where trust collapses? If you have, you already know what I felt. I closed my laptop. My reflection stared back at me in the dark screen, a tired woman with dark circles under her eyes, a stranger in her own skin. I made a silent vow to that stranger. I would not let them win. I would not let them erase me. The silence would be my strength. I would not yell. I would not explain. I would not defend. I would just act. I had a different set of weapons now. And the first one was patience. I was a soldier who had learned to watch and wait. So I began to watch and wait. The lawsuit began. It was a drawn-out, messy affair. Douglas and Eva were on the offensive, relentless in their attacks. They painted a picture of a deceitful, opportunistic sister who returned only for inheritance she didn't deserve. The media loved it. The daily reports were a fresh wave of public shame. They had me in the courtrooms, the public arena, and the headlines. I had no defense. But they didn't know I was a ghost. They didn't know I had learned to move unseen. I was in a war zone, and I was going to fight it like one. I didn't respond to the media. I didn't engage with the accusations. I let the silence speak for me. And in the silence, I listened. I watched. The hum was different now. It wasn't a warning, and it wasn't a roar. It was a low thrum of anticipation. A slow, steady rhythm. The flicker in the overhead lights wasn't a distraction. It was a signal. It was the sign of a system that was starting to fail. The spark came from an unexpected source. A small package arrived at my lawyer's office. No return address. Inside was a flash drive. I knew, without having to check, that it was from Mason. My younger brother, warm steel. I had seen him in court. He never looked at me. He looked at the floor, at the walls, at anything but me. Now I knew why. He was ashamed. Not of me, but of himself. I took the drive to a secure location and opened it. It was full of emails. My heart pounded as I read them. They were conversations between Douglas and Eva, a meticulous record of their plot. They had been planning this for months. They had gone through my father's papers, found his original will, and forged a new one. They had created the fake discharge papers and planted them in the family's archival documents. And then they had leaked them to the press. The flash drive contained copies of the forged documents, screenshots of their communications, and a timeline of the entire operation. It was all there. The entire, grotesque betrayal, laid out in cold, hard facts. The flicker wasn't an accident. It was a blueprint. I gave the flash drive to my lawyer. He was a good man, a veteran himself. He looked at the evidence, his face grim. "This is a whole other level," he said. "This isn't just about the will. This is criminal fraud." I went to the final hearing, a day that had become the climax of the long, public spectacle. Douglas was on the stand again, his voice full of righteous indignation. He was close to a final verdict, a final victory. His lawyer, Eva, was smiling, her rehearsed grace in full effect. My lawyer stood up. He didn't speak. He walked to the judge's bench and handed him a new folder. A thin, tan folder. The judge opened it. He read the documents inside. His face, usually a mask of neutrality, began to change. He looked from the documents to the defense attorney, to Douglas, and then finally to me. The hum in the courtroom seemed to stop. The flicker in the lights was a sudden blackout. The judge looked at the courtroom, at the media, at the gallery. Then he looked at Douglas. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice low and steady. "You have a choice. You can admit to your actions here, or you can let the full force of the law determine your fate." Douglas, his face pale, shook his head. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his brittle charm cracking under the pressure. This is a lie. My lawyer spoke then, his voice cutting through the silence. Your Honor, we have evidence of a criminal conspiracy to defraud my client and the estate of her late father. He then explained, concisely, the contents of the flash drive. The room went silent. Douglas's face drained of all color. He looked at Eva, and her expression of practiced grace finally broke. It was a flicker of fear, a flicker of panic. It was a face reveal. The mask had come off. The judge looked at the court police. Close the doors, he said. No one moves. From that moment, the balance was mine. The truth, once released, cannot be contained. The arrests followed, not just for Douglas, but for Eva and a few others involved. The public reaction was swift and merciless. They were the ones who were now branded as frauds, as liars. The narrative was flipped, the story rewritten. But I didn't gloat. I didn't go to the media. I didn't make a victory lap. I had what I needed. Quiet justice. I went back to the house on the cliff. It had sat empty for months, a silent witness to the war I had fought. It was a beautiful place, but it was also a place of pain. I didn't just move in. I began to reclaim it. It was a process of slow, disciplined rebuilding. The house was not just a symbol of my inheritance, it was a symbol of my recovery. The first thing I did was take out the overgrown weeds in the garden. They were everywhere, choking the life out of the rose bushes my mother had planted. I worked every day, my hands in the dirt, the smell of damp earth and salt in the air. I didn't just pull them out, I pulled them out by the root. It was an act of reclamation, a quiet defiance. The hum of the world was replaced by the sound of my own breath, the scraping of my trowel, the gentle crash of the waves below. I put up new boundaries. I didn't answer calls from extended family members who had sided with Douglas. I didn't respond to the emails that now begged for my forgiveness. The silence, which had once been a weapon, was now a sanctuary. I had learned to discern between the people who deserved my energy and the ones who didn't. My alliance was with Mason. He was the only one who had reached out. The day after the arrests, he drove out to the house and sat on the porch. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he just said, "I'm sorry, Evie. I should have told you. I was scared." He was still the quiet, warm steel I had known. He wasn't a hero. He was just a brother. And that was enough. He helped me with the garden. We didn't talk much. We just worked. We repaired the cracks in the walls, planted new seeds, and watched the frost on the windows in the mornings. The frost was a different kind of signal now. It was a cold truth, but it was beautiful in its precision, in its detail. It was a reminder that even in the cold, there was beauty and there was hope. I started a new mission. I took the family land trust, the small vineyards and properties, and I sold them. All of it. Except for the house. The money I used to start a veterans outreach center. Not for fanfare, but for healing. A quiet place for men and women like me to find a way back home. I didn't need the legacy of my father's land. I was creating my own. A legacy of hope. A legacy that was built not on inheritance, but on purpose. The house was no longer a symbol of my father's past, it was a symbol of my future. I had built a new bridge, a new way forward. There was still one last chapter to close. The final chapter wasn't a public trial. It was a small, almost silent note. I received a letter from Douglas from prison. It was short. 2 sentences. I was wrong. I was always wrong. I didn't feel vindication. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt peace. The hum was gone. The flicker had faded. There was only a quiet stillness. The quiet of a new life. Today, I woke up at dawn. The air was cool and smelled of salt and dew. The sun was a soft, pale gold, just beginning to touch the cliffs. I walked to the garden. I tended the roses my mother planted. They are thriving now in the space where the weeds once choked them. Their petals are a perfect crimson, a stark contrast to the gray sky. I sit on the porch, a cup of coffee in my hand. The quiet is a welcome presence. The waves crash below, a steady rhythm that has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. The frost on the window pane is a beautiful, intricate pattern, a reminder that even in the cold, there is beauty. The house, which was once a symbol of betrayal and a battlefield, is now a place of healing. A home. I didn't just survive. I learned to thrive. I learned that my story, my honor, my very identity, could not be taken from me. It could only be given away. And I refused to give it away. I learned that silence is not weakness. It's a force. A quiet, patient force that can outlast any lie. I learned that justice isn't always a public spectacle. Sometimes it's a quiet moment in a garden, a cup of coffee at dawn. I am not the woman who walked into that courtroom. I am a new woman. One who has found her way back to the truth, not just of her family, but of herself. I have found my way home. Have you found your way back from betrayal? If you've ever walked through something like this, tell me your story in the comments. I read them all, and someone out there needs to hear what you've survived. And if you want more stories that remind you you're not alone, stay here with me for the next one.